Thank you for coming today, ladies, and I hope you are having a fantastic time. As you see, I am not there with you in person. I'm currently in Arizona getting ready to see the Grand Canyon. But I was so excited for you to see what I've prepared for you that I wanted to try this opportunity to try a new program. So I hope you'll enjoy it. Early American education is the focus of today's thing. So where does education begin? Well, there's three main categories that I'd like you to keep in mind. They're early beginnings, education through the years, and education now. Although I don't have the time to go in depth here, I'll try to cover the main ideas and points as best I can. So let's begin. Early American education was focused around religious components and not necessarily the ability to read and write. That was reserved for the upper classes. So most people's education was being able to recite the Lord's Prayer or the Ten Commandments. Boys who showed a greater aptitude would study at the local church and become clergymen or potentially have the ability to go on to university. Again, most people in this time did not know how to read or write or understand the language of a contract. This would later become a very critical point. Before the Revolution, in the mid to late 1600s, many northern territories are starting to open up public education and make it mandatory. The focus being on reading, writing, arithmetic, understanding the history, and that would open up higher education, such as Harvard opening in 1636. That later becomes important because it opens up the door for grammar schools, which opens up the door for women to be educated in the 1700s. And by the end of the 1700s, you have the majority of Ivy League schools opening up. And by the mid to late 1800s, all Ivy League schools have opened up and more. So we're going to be talking about other areas of education, including the Revolutionary time period and Civil War. So during the Revolutionary time period, you have these schools opening up. So remember that not being able to understand a contract? Well, our founding fathers thought that this was super important. And the first founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, believed that public education was so paramount for democracy that it served all of the people. They believed that in order for our democracy to survive, everybody needed to be educated. But this creates a split between the southern and northern states. Northern states believed in the free and public education for all people, and the southern states believed that if you wanted an education, then you would find some way to pay for it. Therefore, only people who could pay for education were the ones who deserved to be educated. So then the Civil War happens, and Southern Reconstruction occurs. After the Civil War, the main aspect of Reconstruction in the South, or one of, is opening up public education to all of the people, which then creates this movement with people gaining support, which is what the school movement is going to be talking about, is what different things do we have. So public support is this universal concept of education. Education should be available to everyone. And this opens up elementary schools and high schools later, and middle schools would come after high school. I know it's weird that middle school's after high school, but there's a reason for it. So public support was schools should serve the poor as well as the wealthy. Then the next thing that starts to occur is gender roles. In early education, the dominantly male roles occurred. Women were later added as a cheaper form of workforce, that it didn't take as much to educate the women. And most women who were teachers were considered spinsters, which becomes a problem when you start having this informal segregation between women as teachers and men as administrators. Because a lot of times, if a male was still a teacher or a female was an older teacher and they were unmarried, they were considered to be gay, or they had rumors of being gay spread about them, which would cause them issues. But women couldn't work if they were married, but men were expected to find a wife or spouse. So that's one area of issues, and doesn't really help that we have this informal segregation going on with that. Then we start seeing secondary education form and evolve. Sorry, I didn't pace this very well. So secondary education evolved with the Kalamazoo case. And this was a case that helped form federal funding for high schools, which would later include the legal basis. And then there is such a specialized need that starts to show up for these other students between the ages of about 11, 12 to 13, 14. Their bodies are changing so much and they've got so many hormones going through them that we find we actually need this development of junior highs and middle schools for pre-adolescents to understand what's happening in their body, as well as the emotions and hormones that's creating a massive chasm. And that's why you see high schools form first, and then junior highs, which will later become middle schools. Then we start to see the central role of schools change. First, you have the Committee of 10, which recommends what type of education should we have? What courses should high school students be taking, including history and science classes? And because we're going to be having these English and math and history and science courses, how do we standardize these courses, which makes it easier to train teachers all across this country? Later, in modern times, you actually form the public education department, and that was formed to make dissemination of information easier to every school district in the United States. Then in the last few decades, we've had the No Child Left Behind Act and Every Student Succeeds Act. These were great theories, but it forced a stricter standardization to occur, not only on the children, but on teachers. But why were these acts created in the first place? Well, No Child Left Behind Act was created as if a student moves from East Coast to West Coast or northern states to southern states, are they going to miss out on any opportunities? Well, Every Student Succeed Act was meant to reduce the amount of standardized exams and stress that students had on it and make the focus about learning. But part of this standardizing includes the teacher evaluation, which is one thing that we're going to be going over. So part of this is the testing example. So this past year, I had 33 students who were taking a history exam. They were my AP students. Out of those 33 students, 0 were considered advanced, and that's that green area at the top of the screen. 8 were considered proficient, which is pretty good. It means that they're about grade level. 18 were nearing proficiency, which means that they're actually nearing grade level and they're understanding the information. 7 were basic, which means that they basically failed the exam. They are below grade level and they're not performing well. Part of the problem with this exam is that, as I said, these were my AP students. And my AP students are taught on a different curriculum versus the regular education classes for this history course. And so the exam styles are different and the exam information is different. And since I'm teaching an AP course, I'm teaching towards the AP exam, not necessarily the end of course exams. So this is one area of problem because it goes towards my evaluations, which include observations, evaluations, student scores, student attendance, teacher attendance, and professionalism, which is generally not a bad thing. But when you start considering how all of those different categories break down, that's when we start to see issues. So 85 points comes from my observations, 15 come from my evaluations, 50 come from my student scores, 15 come from student attendance, 20 from my teacher attendance, and 15 from professionalism. So that first score of 85 points is actually 2 separate things. I have an observation in the fall and I have an observation in the spring. The observation in the fall is 60 points, and the observation in the spring is 45 points. So then the evaluations are technology training that I can show that I've done professional development stuff and other things that don't necessarily come out in observation. The student scores come from the combined average of all of my students in that 50-point range, which sometimes works to my advantage, sometimes not. This year, if it was just that one course, I would actually get 50% of those points. The student attendance, I can promise you I'm not going to get a total points for my student attendance because they don't like to show up to class. My teacher attendance works differently. Last year, if I missed 3 days or less, then I got all of those points back, which meant that I would get 6 points back on my teacher attendance. Versus this year, they actually bumped that up to 6. If I miss 6 or less days, then I get all of those points back. That means 12 points towards my teacher attendance score. Even though I'm supposed to be guaranteed 10 absences for the full school year, I am only allowed to really take 6 of those. And then the last one is my professionalism, which is determined based off of my dress. And my teacher dress code is just as ambiguous as the dress code for students. And the only person who can determine that is going to be my principal. So if he doesn't like me wearing pants all the time or like me wearing skirts all the time or whatever, he can determine that I'm not being professional. And that comes out in different ways. So there are some of the issues that go on with the teacher evaluation. So, as we consider all of these different things, understand that this is just one aspect of the teacher stuff. Again, I apologize. My pacing is not very good. I had to make the video first and then do the voice recording. So what about everything else, such as segregation versus integration, inequality, and special education? So we're going to be here for a little while because this is one of the big points. So Plessy versus Ferguson was a case that comes out of Louisiana to the Supreme Court. Louisiana had created a new state law that said if you were black, then you needed to sit in a separate car from the whites. So you needed 2 train cars, one for whites, one for blacks. Well, Plessy was a mixed-race gentleman. 7/8 of his background come from European descent. 1/8 comes from African descent. And it's because of that 1/8 that in Louisiana he was classified as black. Well, he bought a white train ticket and sat in the white train car. They asked him to remove himself and to go sit in the black train car, and he refused. He was ultimately arrested, and it went to court. Well, the Supreme Court upheld that law as legal, saying separate but equal. As long as they had equal accommodations, you could keep them separate, which is where Brown v. versus Board of Education comes in play in the 1900s. There are 2 schools in one school district, a white school and a black school. The black school was getting books from the white school and school supplies. The white school had deemed no longer valid stuff to be using. It was outdated. Well, the black school sued the white school and the school district, saying that they were no longer equal. And the Supreme Court upheld that you're correct. It is not equal. They're not getting the same type of education. They are not getting the same type of information. And so the Supreme Court at that point shut down separate but equal regulations. So what about inequality? And I'm not talking about segregation inequality. Here I'm talking about poverty inequality. This comes from a report by a man named James Coleman, where he titled his report Quality of Educational Opportunity. And it is a very controversial thing. It states that it did not matter the school funding, as it has little to do with how well students will do on final achievements. It said that whether a student's ethnic background matters doesn't matter. James Coleman believed that what mattered was whether or not students were receiving the same information and the same educational opportunities. Well, as a teacher who teaches at a Title I school and has taught at low poverty, low socioeconomic classes, it matters, because sometimes those kids come to school starving and all they're thinking about is food. And those students who come from a high socioeconomic status are not thinking about how hungry they are, because they're not hungry. And then you have special education. Well, how many of you have ever heard of Willowbrook State School in New York City? No? Yes? Maybe? Well, we're going to go over this. In 1975, Congress passed the Public Law 94-142 Education for All Handicapped Children, requiring all public schools that accepted federal funds to provide equal access to all students, including handicapped students. This was important because places like Willowbrook had been open since 1947. In these places, families would drop their students off for proper care. But what happened was anything but. These students were put in institutions and left alone by themselves for hours and days and weeks on end, sitting in their own bodily fluids and filth. They would undergo treatment such as electroshock therapy because they made messes on themselves or on the floor. There was even one incident of a nurse who decided to take it upon herself to teach a child how to sit in a chair. This child had no muscle control, so sitting in a chair was not something that they could actually do. The nurse was on her on her dinner break, and she kept picking up the child and putting it back in the chair. And she even tried to tie the child down. Because the child didn't have good muscle control, it couldn't stay in the seat, so it would slide and still be tied to the chair at the same time. Eventually, the nurse becomes so frustrated and enraged that her choice of discipline is to give this child, who is handicapped, both physically and mentally, an ice bath. So back to that education for all in 1975. The time that Willowbrook closed was about 12 years after that act took place, and it's because of reporters sneaking into the institutions and highlighting what was happening here. Many students ended up committing suicide because it was better than living within that state. Eventually, Willowbrook and other institutions like Willowbrook did close, but it showed how important it is that we pay attention to our children and the students that are going on. And that's why the Individuals with Disability Education Act becomes so important, IDEA. It requires schools who received federal funding must provide students with disabilities the ability to move within and around the school. That includes changing the doors to proper regulation width so that wheelchairs can get through, providing ramps for wheelchairs or elevators for students who couldn't climb stairs, or students who are blind, the ability to have information provided in Braille or machines that allow them to type and it comes out in Braille. The ability of students who are deaf to have interpreters and sign language so that they can communicate properly and have the exact education that they need. This becomes important as we start to see education change into today. I might mention at this point that Mom might be answering some questions and no, she doesn't know about it. Thanks! Again, I'm sorry about my timing and having to record the video first and then the audio. I thought I had paced myself better. I'm very sorry. If you have the ability to skip forward, please do so. It's fine. Okay, so education today includes things like IEPs, or Individualized Education Plans, which are set in place for students who qualify for special education. That includes students who have learning disabilities or might be gifted. The big problem here is that if a child is gifted, they're not necessarily guaranteed an education for their needs because there's no federal regulation. So not every state provides gifted education. And those states that do are actually creating stricter points on what it means to be educated and how that education can be brought about. So that's one area of issue, and especially because a lot of states are starting to pull back what kind of programs they're providing to gifted students. But let's say that you don't have an IEP or you don't qualify for an IEP. There are some other things that we're going to talk about here that do actually cover proper education. So healthcare plans are for students who have some kind of medical diagnosis that requires that the school knows and be able to properly take care of them. This can include asthma, diabetes, migraines, any sorts of things. Again, Mom can probably answer those questions way better than I ever could, because that was her area of expertise. But anything under the healthcare plan does need to be provided with a general practitioner showing that they have it. But let's say that you don't have something that covers IEPs or healthcares. This is where 504 plans can come into play. They show that a student is definitely in need of additional supports, and so what can we do for them? That's the 504 plan. Technology is going to be a permanent part of the classroom, whether it's used to deliver notes or some other component of the learning process, such as videos or anything. Training is something that every teacher throughout the entire school year is going to go through. And oftentimes there are many teachers who also go through training during the summer. This training can be in form of technology, understanding how socioeconomic status can affect their education, or different changes in their curriculums, or understanding their main field if there is anything new. Well, that's everything. I hope that I've answered all of your questions to the best of my ability. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to email me or write them down and give them to Mom, and she can get them to me at some point, and I will do my best to answer them. I hope you all have a fantastic day and that this was informative and interesting for you to participate in. Thank you.